Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I'm Devyani Chaturvedi, Research Analyst at ISAS, and I will be your host for today's episode. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's recent visit to France marked the 25th anniversary of India and France entering into a strategic partnership. Just as both states acknowledged the ties to be in excellent shape, they issued a comprehensive roadmap for a renewed partnership between the two countries for the next 25 years, referred to as the Horizon Communique 2047. This roadmap has identified three key pillars of cooperation, namely partnership for security, which includes cooperation in space, defense, civil nuclear energy, and critical technology. Second is partnership for planet, including endeavors on financing energy transition and decarbonizing hydrogen. And lastly, partnership for people, which includes endeavors on student mobility and integrating cultural ties and working towards a better Indo-France relationship. Issues of sovereignty have also been identified as a key part of the partnership, with a roadmap for Indo-France engagement in the Indo-Pacific being introduced. To further deconstruct the India-France multidimensional strategic partnership, we have with us today Dr. Jean-Loup Samaan, a senior research fellow at the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. He specializes in Middle East strategic affairs with a particular focus on Israel-Hezbollah conflict and the evolution of the Gulf security system. Welcome, Dr. Samaan.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Well, I will begin with my first question. Many in India deem France as the new Russia for New Delhi. Can you explain the strategic significance of the bilateral relationship and its motivations for both New Delhi and Paris?
Well, first, as your introduction perfectly pointed out, the partnership between France and India is quite deep and involves a lot of different sectors. This diversified a lot in the last 2 decades, and I think for both sides there are mutual benefits. Having said that, as you said, a big assumption is could France become the new Russia of India? And the implicit assumption here being could France replace Russia in particular when it comes to strategic cooperation, arms sales? So far, it's not yet the case. If you check the breakdown of arms sales, arms imports from Russia, France, and let's say the US, as far as I remember, Russia still represents almost like half of India's arms imports. France is a significant supplier. It represents, I believe, about 25%. But it's a long way to replace Russia. So I'm not even sure that this is the ultimate goal. But definitely, France provides let's say an alternative, a convenient alternative to India, which is not as big as consequential as the US, but which is probably an interesting Western ally when you want to have a policy of diversification, of multi-alignment, like the current Indian government wants to promote. So that I would argue that it is not yet the new Russia, but it's reflecting a new multi-balanced approach of the Indian foreign policy.
Right, interesting. I think so. What we see also is that both India and France are privileging the idea of strategic autonomy in their respective foreign policies. So, what can France and India learn from each other in terms of navigating this intensifying great power competition between the US and China?
Well, I think it's a key to understand the importance of the bilateral relation. This word of or the concept of strategic autonomy. It's important for the history, the trajectory of both countries. Let's say since the end of the end of the Second World War. Both countries cherished their independence, their sovereignty, and that explains a lot of their, let's say, complicated relationship with the US. So even in the beginning of the strategic partnership in 1998, from the beginning, this was marked by this idea of strategic autonomy. The French government at that time decided not to side with the US, which was sanctioning India for the nuclear test. If we try to remember at that time, there was strong pressure on India because of its nuclear test, and France decided to not ignore the topic, but to downplay its importance and to prioritize the partnership. And I think that related already to this idea of shared interests when it comes to strategic autonomy. This is, I believe, even more relevant today with regards to the Indo-Pacific environment. The fact that both countries, in different ways, I mean, these are not very similar, not completely similar strategies, but both countries try to avoid the, let's say, simplistic narrative of a bipolar competition between the US and China, and the situation where it's either you're with the US or with China. And I think for both countries it makes even more sense today to strengthen their strategic autonomy through this partnership. Having said that, and you ask also about the lessons, I think it's important to keep in mind that the way both countries understand and experience strategic autonomy is quite different. India is, in a sense, much more autonomous when it comes to its foreign policy than France. Let me explain what I mean here. France is still, at the end of the day, a member of NATO. France is a treaty ally of the US. There is no ambiguity about that. France, of course, maintains its own nuclear deterrent, but it doesn't in the current environment, doesn't conceive its military scenarios, especially at the conventional level, without considering support from NATO countries, and in particular the US. And that's a very important element, that the defense policy of France cannot be separated from its European, its NATO, and eventually US environment. And I think that's quite different from what we see with India, which historically, for many different reasons, because of the conflict with Pakistan, because of disputes with the US on several items, has had to conceive its defense policy completely, in a sense, apart from that dimension. So at the end of the day, both countries may share some aspects of strategic autonomy, I'd say, especially at the diplomatic level, but at the military operational level, you can see that there are some nuances and some limitations in terms of the analogy.
So, Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit as the chief guest at the French National Day resulted in and facilitated significant defense deals, including the purchase of a sea-based version of Rafale fighter jets for the Indian Navy, co-production of Scorpion-class submarines, and possible French offer on jet engines. What do we know about these negotiations, and where do you see the defense relationship between India and France heading, especially given that you just mentioned that there is limited growth that we see in terms of strategic autonomy when it comes to French defense ties with India?
I think it was an important announcement for different reasons. First, it confirms previous sales that we saw in the last decade, and in particular when the Indian Air Force selected the Rafale fighter jet back in 2015. So this follows previous major sales. What's interesting is that you can see that as France defense industry becoming a major element of the modernization of the Indian armed forces. It's also important probably as a signal to the US, especially after the visit of Prime Minister Modi to Washington just a few weeks before that visit to France. because the US is also very keen on increasing its access to the Indian military market. But if we get into the details, there are also demands from India that I don't think the US defense industry is willing or to consider. In particular, the Made in India requirements, the expectations that there will be knowledge transfer, that the arms sales should also support the local industry. This is something that has been also difficult at first with the French defense industry. I mean, we had in the past several rounds of negotiations and arguments between the French industry and the Indian counterparts. But I think now there's a better arrangement between both sides. And I'm not sure that, given the history of US arms sales, that the US defense industry would be in the same situation to accept that. So that is also an important element to consider when we discuss the arms sales. But definitely a big announcement that was made last week.
Right. I think one of the major defense items India may seek France's assistance on is India's nuclear attack submarine program. Now, France has helped India build its conventional submarine capability. What do you think about, or what do we know about the negotiations on the nuclear submarine deal? Is it possible, especially given the fallout of the AUKUS deal?
Well, I mean, first of all, as a very clear disclaimer, I do not know anything more than what is said or reported in the media. So, as far as I understand, we are left with speculations at this stage that there has been discussions on the possibility of cooperation in that field of nuclear attack submarines. The big question relates to first AUKUS and what it means for the let's say the arms race in the region, and there's certainly an element of the discussion in Paris that looks at this topic, considering the fact that in the case of the submarine deal with Australia, which were, with regards to the French offer, considering conventional submarines, this was cancelled and replaced by a US offer that includes a nuclear dimension. So there might be some rationale to say that to maintain the relevance of France in the environment and to avoid a situation similar to what we saw with AUKUS, France should be also considering what the Americans are providing to the Australians, but here, in this case, to India. Now, having said that, we see that the AUKUS nuclear element is already steering a lot of anxiety or a lot of nervousness among Asian countries. There's the argument that this is fueling a potential nuclear race in the area. So, and we saw that following the first reports of the discussions a few months ago, a lot of the Asian newspapers were publishing pieces, comments, which were alerting on France and India contributing to this race. So let's say that there's probably a dilemma. At this stage, I don't know, to be honest with you, if a final decision has been taken. But definitely, if this was to follow, this would be a major decision in terms of strengthening even more the bilateral partnership. But this would definitely be met with condemnation, and in particular from China and possibly Pakistan. So I guess it's the big conundrum at this stage to see if it's worth deepening the partnership, if that means becoming an element of the regional dispute.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your insights on that. So, as we discuss military and defense ties, a key part of the Horizon Communique 2047 is also issues about sovereignty and cooperation on that regard. And it is in light of that we see a lot of focus on joint efforts in the Indo Pacific Partnership. So, unlike other European powers, France is a resident power in the Indo Pacific. New Delhi may not be geographically proximate to Europe, but sees it as an important actor in global politics and as essential to a multipolar world. Can you elaborate on the congruence and divergence of these interests in the Indo Pacific and Europe, especially given the French interests in China and India's interest in Russia?
Yes, well, I mean, first of all, when you ask the French officials, they would argue that cooperation with India in this area, and in particular in the Indian Ocean, even started before everyone talked about the Indo-Pacific. And India was very instrumental in bringing France as part of the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, which was initiated almost 2 decades ago now. India was also supportive of France joining the Indian Ocean Rim Association. Again, with the idea, as you mentioned, that France is not an external country; it is a resident state of the Indian Ocean. So, what I mean here is that started even before the issue of the Indo-Pacific emerged, but definitely since the Macron government released its first Indo-Pacific strategy in 2019, India has been at one of the pillars of that strategy. And that relates also to this idea that France wants to promote a third way, an alternative to the US-China competition in the Indo-Pacific. France wants to emphasize regional initiatives, trilateral dialogues. And on that, it sees India as its natural partner. For instance, on new dialogues such as the one with the UAE, India, France dialogue, which would focus, for instance, on maritime security in the Indian Ocean. Other initiatives such as France-India-Japan dialogue, or the France-India-Australia dialogue that was suspended for a few months, almost a year, following AUKUS, but which resumed recently. So in all of these initiatives, there is an element of complementarity, because India probably, and as mentioned several times in Modi's public speeches, India does not embrace fully the view of the US when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. It has a different understanding of, let's say, the geographical scope of the Indo-Pacific, and about the priorities, the foreign policy approach for the Indo-Pacific. And I think if you read and you compare the documents or the speeches, the French approach is closer. Now, having said that, you probably had in mind also when you mentioned France's relations with China, the Macron speech, the interview that President Macron gave to the media last April after his trip to China, and in the middle of a Chinese or PLA drill over Taiwan. And at that time, President Macron said that, if I try to remember exactly the wording, that France and Europe should not follow the US on the conflict that it is not in its own interest. And this was widely condemned, criticized, and in some ways misread, because what Macron was trying to argue is that Europe and France should have its own understanding, its own foreign policy on Taiwan, and not be automatically aligned on the US. But I think this also shows you the limits of the French approach on the Indo-Pacific. The fact that France is trying to position itself as a credible third way, credible alternative to the great power competition. But at the end of the day, it remains a small, or let's say middle power of Europe, which, as I said earlier, relies on the US for its security. So at the end of the day, it has its own limitations on what it can provide to the Indo-Pacific. And I believe the Indian government is probably very realistic about what it can get and cannot get from France on that.
Thank you so much. I think that contextualizes the Indo-French relations very well for our listeners. And I think now coming to my last question, which is inevitably a perennial question when it comes to India, which is that how willing do you think Paris is now to support its natural partner in India's membership in the United Nations Security Council? How does India's membership serve French interests?
Well, I think there are two elements to the question. Let's say that the Indian membership to the UN Security Council would serve France because of what we just discussed. The fact that if France is promoting this idea of strategic autonomy and also a way to avoid the simplistic narrative of a bipolar competition, it makes sense from a French standpoint to promote India as a new member. And also the fact that it also deepens the partnership, the bilateral partnership, to have one of your closest partners as a member of the UN Security Council. Having said that, there are several elements where I would express some skepticism, more on the feasibility in the current environment, because I don't think, given the state of the UN Security Council today, that this is the time for such an ambitious reform. You may argue that it's never the right timing, but definitely in the current environment, given the tensions over Ukraine, I don't see how any major reform of the UN Security Council could be implemented. So it's, in a sense, it's not even a matter of if France is serious about it, but if France can deliver on this. And by design, it could not be the only one to make that decision. So I doubt that this is a likely scenario at this stage in 2023, unfortunately, for our Indian audience.
Thank you so much for attempting to answer that question so very well. Again, thank you. We're so glad that we could have such an insightful conversation and look at India-France relations from a French perspective as well.
Well, thank you very much for this discussion. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you. You were listening to South Asia Chat. To learn more about our work, please visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates from our social media platforms. We are on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter.